Welcome back to Macbeth Explained, Annotate with me. Today we're going to be looking at Act 1, Scene 2. Even though this scene isn't particularly long, it does provide us with quite a lot of information. So just like last time, if you'd like to pause, grab your copy of the text, grab your pens, highlighters, anything that you need, and get comfortable because this one's going to be quite long, as I'll be breaking down quite a lot of new terms. I'll be explaining who new characters are, and I will be discussing quite a few important quotations. This scene is an important scene in terms of exposition. So exposition is a part in a story where the writer establishes important information about the world of the story, the setting, the characters, or the situation. In this case, we find out a lot of information that we need to know in order to better understand what's going to happen later on in the story. So without further ado, I'm going to begin Act 1, Scene 2. A camp near Forres. So this is a place in Scotland. And we'll hear about several places in Scotland. We'll hear about Glamis, Fife, the castle of Dunsinane. All of these words might appear a little bit confusing, but all you have to remember is that they're just places, and you don't really need to know about any of these places to do well in the exam. Alarum within. So this is just the archaic form of the word alarm. Basically, trumpets are being rung to indicate either a battle or someone. In this case, the trumpets are probably ringing to announce the arrival of King Duncan. So this is the archaic version of alarm. Enter Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain, Lennox with attendants, meeting a bleeding sergeant. So really quickly, I'll make some notes. Duncan is the King of Scotland. He is an important character. Malcolm and Donalbain are his sons. It's important to remember their names. Lennox is a thane, which means a lord. And Lennox is important in the sense that he is a character that often delivers exposition. So he is a character that often appears in the scene to sort of let the audience know what's happening. So Lennox will definitely crop up again. With attendants, servants, meeting a bleeding sergeant. A sergeant is basically an officer in Duncan's army. Duncan, what bloody man is that? He can report, as seemeth by his plight, of the revolt the new estate. So every time you're going to see eth at the end of a word seemeth, you just shorten it. You basically ignore the ETH as seems. Eventually, I'll stop translating these because you'll sort of learn how to recognize them and you'll automatically start translating them in your heads. He can report as seems by his plight of the revolt the new estate. Looking at the state that he's in, he can probably tell us about what's happened, the latest things that have happened in this battle. So Duncan can see that the sergeant has been brought in, he's clearly injured, and he can tell from the state that the man is in that he was probably at one of the most recent battles. So he says, he can report to us what's happening in the battle. Malcolm, his son, says, this is the sergeant who, like a good and hardy soldier, fought against my captivity. So here we find out that Malcolm was almost kidnapped and saved by the sergeant. This isn't an important plot point, so we won't really make annotations on this, but that's what he's saying. Hail, brave friend. So hail, again, is a word that will crop up quite a lot, and it's a term of greeting. Instead of saying, hi, they would say hail, and it's a little bit more respectful. We'll hear it again when the witches come back. Hail, brave friend, say to the king the knowledge of the broil that as thou didst leave it. So broil is like like the battle, the conflict, and it's got connotations of sort of chaos, like a fray. Like when the witches use the word hurly-burly, it's kind of similar. And then we're seeing a couple more archaic terms. And again, I will translate these near the beginning, but as we carry on throughout the scenes, you will sort of get used to these words and you will sort of hopefully learn how to translate them in your heads automatically. So when a character says thou, they mean it's an archaic term and it just means you. And as we carry on through the scenes, you'll notice that a lot of the time, automatically, I will be reading thou as you. It's a habit that I've grown into from having spent years and years reading and teaching Shakespeare. It's a habit that you want to get into as well. If you're wondering in terms of quotation accuracy, during the exam, you should be using thou instead of you. My advice as an examiner is, as best you can, just try to write the more modern version of the quote that you can think of, because it's going to be easier for you to understand the quote, and you don't need to worry too much about the archaic language. So long as you understand the quote and you can explain it and analyze it in lots of details, it doesn't have to be written down with complete accuracy, word for word. So for example, you could have written as you left it instead of as thou didst leave it, just to make your life easier. Examiners mark for references, not quotations. So as long as you have the keywords sort of accurate and you can analyze those, the rest of the quote doesn't need to be accurate in order to get marks. So that means you, and didst is kind of like seemeth. The st at the end is sort of just the archaic form of the word did. Say to the king the knowledge of the brawl as you left it. Tell the king what was happening in the battle when you left. The sergeant says, doubtful it stood. So the battle seemed doubtful. It wasn't sure, no one was sure what the outcome was going to be. The outcome of the battle was uncertain. This little speech by the sergeant has actually come up in a past exam for English literature AQA. And so it gives you a good example of the type of scenes and extracts that the exam boards select. They usually have quite a lot of information in them and lots of interesting language for you to analyze. As two spent swimmers that do cling together and choke their art, the two sides of the army he's using a simile here, and he's saying they're both like two swimmers stuck out at sea that are too tired to swim and kind of clinging to each other, like trying to hold on to each other, but sort of bringing each other down at the same time. So if, for example, you were in the middle of the ocean and you were too tired to swim and you were holding on to someone, you'd probably be dragging each other down. That's basically what the two armies are like. They're both on their kind of last legs, struggling to keep going. The merciless MacDonald. So MacDonald is another Scottish lord. He betrayed the king. He betrayed King Duncan. The merciless MacDonald, worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him. He's saying he is worthy to be a rebel. Of course he's going to turn out to be a traitor. He's swarmed, he's filled with villainies. Villainies is like the kind of flaws that make you a villain. He's so full of bad qualities that he was always going to turn out to be a traitor. From the western isles of kerns and gallowglasses is supplied. So kerns here is a word you'll see a couple more times throughout the text. It's foot soldiers. Foot soldiers are soldiers that walk on foot as opposed to riding horses. They'd have really simple weapons. So foot soldiers, and gallowglasses were basically like mercenaries. Mercenaries, a soldier that doesn't fight for a specific army, you just pay them and they'd fight for you. And gallowglasses would be sort of heavily armed, quite good soldiers. Good armor, good equipment, because they can afford to, because they're mercenaries. They get literally paid to fight. So the battle is uncertain. It's unsure which side is going to win because both sides are struggling when MacDonald gets a fresh supply of foot soldiers and mercenaries. So he gets a fresh supply of soldiers that come to back him up. And fortune is like luck. And you see the term fortune being used quite a lot in Shakespeare's texts. And luck, on his damned quarrel smiling, showed like a rebel's whore. And luck is like smiling down on MacDonald's enemies like she's his whore, like she's his prostitute. It's like luck is kind of serving MacDonald. So MacDonald is really lucky. Luck is on his side. She's smiling down upon his enemies. He's got this fresh supply of soldiers. But all is too weak. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that luck is on his side. It doesn't matter that he's got new soldiers. Because brave Macbeth, and well he deserves that name. He deserves to be called brave. Disdaining fortune, ignoring luck, in spite of luck. He doesn't care about who's lucky and who's not. With his brandished steel. So brandishing is when you hold something up and steel is his sword. With his sword held up. Which smoked with bloody execution. He's killed so many soldiers that his sword is literally steaming with blood. So we have this sort of incredibly powerful descriptions of Macbeth as this brave soldier, almost superhuman, just brandishing his sword, and it's covered in blood that's steaming in the air. So we have this imagery used by Shakespeare to create this really impressive image of Macbeth on the battlefield. Like Valor's minion. A minion is like a favorite. So if you were, for example, the king's minion, you were the king's favorite. And valor is like bravery and honor. So here we have the personification of valor, bravery, and Macbeth is like the favorite of bravery, the bravest of men. Carved out his passage till he faced the slave. So Macbeth is carving his way through the enemy army. He's basically cutting his way through his enemies. So the word carving here is, of course, carving is something that you do to meat, when you're slicing meat to serve it, to eat it. And Macbeth is carving his enemies. He's cutting through his enemies. So again, we have a lot of very violent language. Till he faced the slave. And the slave here is MacDonald. And slave here is an insult. A slave is someone that has, no agency, no worth. He's basically calling MacDonald worthless. So Macbeth cuts his way through his enemies to face the worthless MacDonald. So here, if you were looking at these quotations, we have a lot of powerful verbs. We have brandished, smoked, carved. We have the semantic field of violence as well, with bloody, execution, carving. And we'll talk about this in a second, and we'll be annotating the methods here. Because remember, identifying methods is how you get marks for assessment objective 2, AO2. So Macbeth has carved his way through the enemies, and he's now facing MacDonald on the battlefield, which never shook hands nor bade farewell to him, without even a shake of the hands, without even saying a word to him, till he unseamed him from the nave to the chops, and fixed his head upon our battlements. Without a word, without even sort of acknowledging MacDonald, Macbeth unseams him from the nave to the chops. A seam is, if you look at clothing, is what holds pieces of clothing together. So if you unseam something, you sort of tear it open. And so Macbeth basically slices or opens MacDonald through from the nave, aka the navel or the belly button, to the chops, to his jaws. Macbeth slices MacDonald through from the navel to the jaws, and fixed his heads upon our battlements. And he decapitates him and sticks his head on the battlements. The battlements would be the walls around a military camp. So here in this scene we have Shakespeare uses the semantic field of violence. A semantic field is words that are linked by meaning. In this case, words that are linked to violence. So we have the words bloody, we have the words execution, we have the word carved, the verb carved, we have unseamed, sliced him through, and we have fixed his head upon our battlements. So we've got a lot of violent language, and all of this creates an image. This is what we call imagery. It creates an image of Macbeth as this incredibly brave soldier, but also incredibly ruthless, savage on the battlefield. To create an image of Macbeth as a brave character, but also okay, so in this case here, we do see the violence of Macbeth, but it's presented to us as being efficient. Macbeth here isn't presented like a brute or a barbarian or a murderer. He's presented to us as this incredibly efficient soldier. Nothing shakes him, nothing moves him, and he kills with absolute brutality. But in this case, it's presented as a good thing, as a positive aspect of Macbeth. And when this extract was used for one of the exam questions was actually, how is Macbeth presented as a violent character? And here we do see him as a violent character, but as opposed to later scenes where he is violent, his violence is presented as a positive, as a quality of him. If you had a soldier working for him, you would want your soldiers to be as ruthless and efficient as Macbeth is. And in fact, we can see this from Duncan's reaction to this story. "O valiant cousin, O worthy gentleman." So we've got the keywords valiant. Valiant meaning brave, from the word valor, which we talked about before. Brave. And worthy means the opposite of worthless. So when we called MacDonald a slave, he's worthless, he's not worth anything. Worthy means worthy of respect and worthy of love. So this is how Duncan views Macbeth. Valiant cousin, worthy gentleman. So we see his respect through this quotation, but we also find something very important in this quotation. Okay, but he calls him cousin. And in those times, cousin didn't necessarily have to be your cousin. It would just be someone that's related to you. So it could be like a distant cousin or a distant relative, and they'd refer to them as kinsmen or cousins. So in this quote, we don't just find out how Duncan views Macbeth, but we also find out, more importantly, that Duncan and Macbeth are related. And of course, that's going to become very important later on. So the sergeant continues his story and he says, "As whence the sun gins his reflection, shipwrecking storms and direful thunders break, so from thy spring whence comfort seemed to come, discomfort swells." So here we have something that I'll explain really quickly, because this is something that's going to come up again and again and again. And this is Shakespeare's use of apostrophes when he's missing letters. So Shakespeare loves writing with rhythm and he loves his lines to sound good. And a lot of the time, in order to have a specific meter or rhythm to his lines, he will shorten words. In this case, he has shortened the word begins and replaced the first part of the word with an apostrophe. So the apostrophe here indicates that there's part of the word that's missing and we kind of fill in the blanks ourselves. So what he's saying is, as when the sun begins his reflection, shipwrecking storms and thunders break, so from that spring whence comfort seemed to come, discomfort swells. He's doing a comparison here, and he's saying, just like when the sun rises after there's been a shipwreck in a storm. So imagine it's the sea again. So again, we have the metaphor of the sea. And again, we're going to have the image of the sea used quite often. It's a motif in Macbeth. It's a sort of recurring image in Macbeth. Just like if at nighttime there was a storm at sea and a shipwreck, and when the sun comes out, you'd expect the sun to bring comfort, but actually it doesn't. Discomfort swells. When the sun begins to rise, instead of the sun bringing hope and comfort, actually the sun rises to bring more problems. So even though Macbeth has just defeated MacDonald, it's not the end of the battle. There's now a new problem. Mark, King of Scotland, mark. When a character tells another character to mark, it's a command. And what it means is pay attention to this. It's another sort of archaic term. We don't use that term anymore. Pay attention, listen closely. So if I say mark this, like pay attention to this, listen to this. So listen to this, King of Scotland, listen. No sooner justice had, with valor armed, compelled these skipping kerns to trust their heels. So as soon as Macbeth has killed MacDonald, and that's kind of persuaded the kerns, the foot soldiers, to turn their heels, as in to turn around and run away. So as soon as Macbeth has executed MacDonald, and MacDonald's soldiers are turning around to run away, but the Norwegian lord, surveying vantage, with furbished arms and new supplies of men, began a fresh assault. So Macbeth has defeated MacDonald's army. MacDonald's army are running away. And the Norwegian lord has actually been observing this vantage, surveying vantage. He's been observing the battle. He's seen that Macbeth has defeated the MacDonald's army, but he's also seen that Macbeth has lost a lot as a result. He was already struggling to begin with. But the Norwegian lord himself has got furbished arms and new supplies of men. So the Norwegian lord's been waiting to get fresh supplies, new soldiers, and he sees that Macbeth, has been fighting all night, so he decides to begin a fresh assault, to start a new battle. So the Norwegian king has been watching the battle with fresh supplies and new soldiers. He starts a new attack on Macbeth. So Macbeth's just survived the night, finally managed to defeat the army. A new army comes down upon him. So Duncan asks, rightfully so, did this dismay our captains, Macbeth and Banquo? Dismayed, not this our captains, Macbeth and Banquo. Dismay is when you're sort of stressed out or distressed by something. Did this not distress our captains, Macbeth and Banquo? So we find out that Macbeth and Banquo are both captains, the leaders in the army, like commanders or generals or something like that. And Duncan is saying, so were they stressed out when they realised this? Did they sort of lose their composure? And the sergeant says, yes. As sparrows, eagles, or the hare, the lion. Yes, they were about as stressed out as an eagle would get stressed out at a sparrow, or as a lion would feel stressed out at a hare. A hare is a type of rabbit. So he's basically saying, yeah, they were about as stressed out as a lion might feel stressed about a rabbit, which of course a lion wouldn't feel threatened at all by a rabbit. Macbeth. So this is a simile to show that Macbeth feel as distressed by the Norwegian attack as a lion might feel distressed by a rabbit. This shows that Macbeth and Banquo are not at all intimidated by this new attack. Again, this sort of reinforces this idea of them being completely sort of, full of courage, unfazed in front of danger, not reckless, but sort of fearless. For I say sooth, and sooth is a word, again, an archaic term that you'll come across quite a lot in Shakespeare's texts, and you'll probably come across this term in some of your Victorian texts, depending on which text you study. Sooth means truth, and characters sometimes will say forsooth, which means in truth, like speaking truthfully. So the sergeant is saying, yes, and if I'm telling you the truth, if I'm speaking the truth, to be honest, I must report they were as cannons overcharged with double cracks. Another simile. Macbeth and Banquo are like cannons filled with double ammunitions. So instead of them being intimidated or distressed by this new attack, they're like cannons that you filled with twice the amount of ammunition. So cannons that are twice as strong. So they doubly redoubled strokes upon the foe, and they start fighting twice as hard. Except they meant to bathe in reeking wounds. They start fighting so hard that it's almost like they're trying to bathe themselves in blood. Again, we have this really violent, gory imagery being used here. Or memorize another Golgotha, I cannot tell. So Golgotha is a biblical reference, the place where Jesus Christ was crucified. And biblical references to Greek and Roman history and mythology are the type of references that Shakespeare uses quite a lot. So knowing about these references can often help you understand what Shakespeare is trying to say. And as best I can, I'll try to explain some of these references as we go on. So it's a biblical reference to the place where Jesus Christ was crucified, according to the Bible. So he's saying Macbeth and Banquo are just fighting twice as hard. It's like they're trying to bathe themselves in blood, or it's like they're trying to create a new Golgotha, a new scene, like a historic massacre, a historic scene of bloody violence. I cannot tell. I can't tell what they were trying to do. All I can tell is that we're fighting, with the extreme bravery and violence. But I am faint. My gashes cry for help. But I'm weak. My wounds are crying for help. I need to tend to my wounds, and I need someone to basically patch him up, fix him up. So the king says, so well thy words become thee as thy wounds. Your words suit you just like your wounds suit you. And here he's not insulting him, saying you deserve these wounds. He's sort of saying it's a sign of your bravery, and your words also show, how brave you are. They smack of honor both. Both of them show how honorable you are. Get him surgeons. Go get him surgeons. He sends for doctors to look after the sergeant. So here I'll explain these archaic terms. Again, these are terms that I'll explain as we begin, but as we carry on throughout the text, I'll start just replacing them with a modern version. Thy means your, so your words. And thee is another version of you. So if we replace these archaic versions with the modern versions, so well your words become you or suit you as your wounds. They both smack of honor. Yeah, your words and your wounds both prove that you have a lot of honor as a soldier. Go get him some doctors. Exit the sergeant attended. So a bunch of servants can help the sergeant out. Who comes here? enter Ross. Now, Ross is another Thane, and he's very similar to Lennox in the sense that he's a character that's mostly here for exposition. He's mostly here to kind of move the plot along. Malcolm says, the worthy Thane of Ross. Lennox says, what a haste looks through his eyes. So should he look that seems to speak things strange. They're looking at Ross and they're noticing that he looks like he's come here in a hurry, and he looks like he's just witnessed something really strange. Ross greets Duncan, God save the king. Duncan says, whence camest thou, worthy Thane? Where did you come from, worthy Thane? Ross says, from Fife, great king, where the Norwegian banners flout the sky and fan our people cold. Norway himself. So here, when you personify a country, Norway or Scotland, you're referring to its king, because the king represents the country. To the king of Norway. So the king represents the country, and the country represents the king. So he's come from Fife, another place in Scotland. We'll find out about who rules this place, the Thane of Fife, later on in the story. We've not heard mention of him. So he's come from another place in Scotland. He's come from Fife, where the Norwegian banners flout the sky and fan our people cold. A banner is almost like it's basically like a really long flag. And if you say, for example, I'm the Norwegian army, I would bring my banners and I would plant my banners in a field that I've just, if I, for example, I fought the army and I won and I've kind of conquered this field, I would plant my banner there so that people can tell, well, I've taken this bit over. If you want to get it back, you're going to have to fight me, and put your banner there. And then it will show that you are now in charge of this place. So in Fife, the Norwegian king has been succeeding because he's planted his banners. Norway himself with terrible numbers, so the king of Norway with a huge number of soldiers, assisted by that most disloyal traitor, the Thane of Cawdor, began a dismal conflict. So the king of Norway starts another battle with a new, fresh supply of soldiers, and he's being helped by a disloyal traitor. He's being held by another traitor. So we had MacDonald first, who's already been killed, but now we have another traitor against the king who's helping Norway. And here, Ross could be referring to the battle that the sergeant was talking about, the new battle where Macbeth is currently fighting. He's being helped by the Lord of Cawdor. Till that Bellona's bridegroom, lapped in proof, confronted him with self-comparisons, point against point rebellious, arm against arm, curbing his lavish spirit, and to conclude, the victory fell upon us. Bellona's bridegroom. So Bellona is the Roman, so this is another Roman mythology reference. So just like before we had a biblical reference, here we have a reference to Roman mythology. Bellona was the goddess of war. So Bellona's bridegroom, the husband of the goddess of war, which implies that he would be the god of war. So Macbeth is like the god of war himself. It's a metaphor to compare Macbeth to the husband of the goddess of war. Again, another high praise. Lapped in proof, confronted him with self-comparisons. So even though Macbeth has sort of less soldiers, he's meeting the king of Norway's army like an equal. Point against point rebellious, arm against arm, for each blow, for every strike that the Norwegian army is trying to land against the Scottish army, Macbeth is fighting back. He's fighting him toe to toe, curbing his lavish spirit, and he kind of pushes the Norwegian king back, and he almost like humbles him. And to conclude, the victory fell upon us. And to conclude, Macbeth won, Scotland won. Great happiness, says Duncan, because now his problems are sorted. Macbeth has not only defeated the traitors, but he's also defeated the Norwegian king himself. Ross says that now Sweno, the Norway's king, so Sweno is the name of the Norwegian king, craves composition. Now that he suffered a defeat, the Norwegian king is ready to negotiate for peace. He knows that he's not going to be able to win through war, to win with his army. So instead, he's kind of trying to negotiate and trying to ask for peace between Norway and Scotland. Nor would we deign him burial of his men till he dispersed a St. Combs inch $10,000 for our general use. And they've basically said to him, so because now he's going to leave, but a lot of his soldiers have died in Scotland, the Scottish soldiers are saying, we are not going to bury your soldiers. We're not going to bury your men until you give us some money for us to use. So basically almost like reimbursement. Like, you've cost us a lot, which war and battles always cost a lot. They cost a lot of equipment, human lives, etc. So they're saying you pay us $10,000. $10,000 would be like silver coins. And in exchange, we'll bury your soldiers. If not, they'll just be left to rot, in essence. Duncan says, no more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest. We're not going to give the Thane of Cawdor another chance to betray us. Go pronounce his present death, and with his former title greet Macbeth. So Duncan doesn't want to allow the Thane of Cawdor another chance to betray him. He gives orders to have the Thane of Cawdor executed, his title taken from him and given to Macbeth as a reward. So a title is basically, your title would be Thane or Lord. So what would happen? So the way this would work is Scotland would be ruled by King Duncan. And in Scotland, there would be different parts of Scotland. For example, Glamis, we've got Fife, and we've got Cawdor. And each of these parts would be ruled by a different lord. The lord would own the land and have a title to be part of sort of nobility, a higher rank in society. And here what Duncan is doing is he takes the title away from the Thane of Cawdor. So the Thane of Cawdor is no longer a Thane, he's no longer a lord, and he no longer owns this land. So that now that he's being executed, his land and his money isn't really going to go to his heirs, like if he has any sons or children or anything like that. His land and his title are going to go to Macbeth, who, let's be honest, has really deserved this. He's literally single-handedly won all these battles for King Duncan. Ross says, I'll see it done. And Duncan says, what he hath lost. So what the Thane of Cawdor has lost, noble Macbeth has won. So everything that the Thane of Cawdor gave up by betraying the king, Macbeth has won. Now, of course, this is dramatic irony because the same thing is sort of going to happen to Macbeth later on. And we won't really touch on that, but I will be mentioning dramatic irony later on. Dramatic irony is when a character says something in the text, but we sort of know better, or when we know something that the characters don't know, when we're a little bit more clued up. And of course, when if we already know the story of the play, reading back through the play, we can see how wrong some of the characters were about certain things that they said, or how certain things that they say later on become directly contradicted by the story or the character's actions. Finally, everyone leaves the scene. And that's the end of the scene. So I know this was quite a long one. I tried to explain it as best as I could. In the future, if there are different things that you'd like me to explain, if you'd like more or less annotations, please feel free to let me know. I try to focus on the things that you sort of need to know, and I try to focus on quotes that are mostly relevant to Macbeth. Here, we don't really need to memorize any quotes or record any quotes on the King of Norway because he's not an important character. Really, what we want to focus on is Macbeth, his character, how he's presented, and maybe Banquo as well, because Banquo is another important character. So if you're taking a moment to record important quotations, I would go for the quotations that describe Macbeth specifically, especially the violent imagery used to describe him and his actions in the battle. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that everything I said was clear, easy to understand. I hope most importantly that this was helpful. In the next video, we will be going over Act 1, Scene 3. So I hope to see you all there. As usual, feel free to leave any questions that you have in the comments. The questions can be about plot, they can be about this scene, they can be about suggestions for what you'd like to see in future videos, or they can be questions about the exams, whether we're talking about AQA literature exams or Edexcel literature exams, advice to do with essay writing, analysis, context, any of the assessment objectives. There is no such thing as a silly question. It's always better to check than to make mistakes. And as I've said before, your questions will be answered by either myself or Miss S, and we're both examiners, so you'll actually be getting answers from actual examiners. I hope to see you all in the next video.